Let's talk about George W. Bush, the 43rd President of the United States. His 2 terms in office were really set to focus on domestic policy, but one single, absolutely transformative day would end up defining not just his entire presidency, but a whole new era of American history. And that right there is the big question we're tackling in this explainer. How can one single event completely flip the script on a leader's agenda, on a nation's priorities, and on America's role in the world? To really get it, we've got to go back to the beginning. So before we get to that defining moment, we need to understand the man who arrived in Washington. His journey to the White House was anything but a straight line. It ended in one of the most controversial, down-to-the-wire elections in U.S. history. Now, even though he was born into a political dynasty, Bush really carved his own path, first in business and then as governor of Texas. But it was his arrival on the national stage that was truly dramatic. The 2000 election against Al Gore, it was so close it led to weeks of recounts, the whole hanging Chads mess, and finally a landmark decision by the Supreme Court. The result was that Bush entered the White House with a nation that was deeply, deeply divided. So picture this. It's just 8 months into his first term. The administration is focused on domestic stuff, education, tax cuts. And then, on a clear Tuesday morning, everything changed. One single event would alter the course of his presidency and the nation forever. On the morning of September 11th, 2001, terrorists turned 4 commercial airliners into weapons. 2 of them struck the World Trade Center in New York, a third hit the Pentagon just outside Washington, D.C., and a fourth, thanks to the unbelievable heroism of its passengers, crashed into a field in Pennsylvania before it could reach its target. And the human cost? It's just staggering. Nearly 3,000 people lost their lives in those attacks. It was a tragedy that brought the entire country to a standstill, uniting Americans in this shared sense of grief, shock, and a brand new kind of resolve. In the wake of the attacks, the Bush administration pivoted completely. The entire domestic agenda was suddenly overshadowed by this new, all-consuming priority, national security. And this led to an immediate and sweeping response that basically reshaped the government itself. The speed and the scale of the government's restructuring was just immense. The Department of Homeland Security was created, a massive undertaking that merged 22 different federal agencies into one. At the same time, the Patriot Act was passed, giving intelligence agencies broad new powers for surveillance, which kicked off a debate about security versus civil liberties that, honestly, we're still having today. And that response quickly went global, leading to 2 very different conflicts. The war in Afghanistan, which launched in late 2001, was a direct retaliation. It was aimed right at the people who planned 9/11, and it had broad international support. The invasion of Iraq in 2003, though, that was different. It was based on a doctrine of preemptive action, acting first against a perceived threat. And that distinction is absolutely key to understanding the controversies that came next. The justification for the Iraq War in particular became a source of really fierce debate. Supporters argued that in this dangerous new world, you had to take decisive action. But when no weapons of mass destruction were found, critics fired back that the war was launched on flawed intelligence, trapping the U.S. in a long and very costly conflict. But the Bush presidency wasn't only defined by the war on terror. Even with foreign policy totally dominating the headlines, the administration pushed forward with a pretty significant domestic agenda. It was all guided by a philosophy Bush himself called compassionate conservatism. 2 key policies really embodied this idea. First, there were major tax cuts in 2001 and again in 2003. The goal was to stimulate the economy by encouraging businesses to invest. Second, there was the No Child Left Behind Act. This was a landmark piece of bipartisan education reform that introduced new federal standards and accountability for public schools all across the country. Now, those tax cuts were central to his economic vision. The administration argued they were absolutely essential for stimulating business and creating jobs. But critics, they countered that the cuts mostly benefited the wealthiest Americans and were a big reason for the growing national debt. So fast forward to Bush's second term, and it was marked by 2 really severe domestic crises. These posed huge challenges to his leadership and frankly left some lasting scars on the country. In 2005, Hurricane Katrina just slammed the Gulf Coast. The devastation in New Orleans was catastrophic, and the federal government's response? It was widely seen as slow and totally inadequate. It severely damaged the administration's reputation for competence and raised some really hard questions about its priorities. And then, just as his presidency was drawing to a close, the financial world basically started to unravel. The U.S. housing market collapsed, and it triggered a domino effect that led to the financial crisis of 2008 and the start of the Great Recession. Bush approved emergency actions to try and stabilize the banks, but the country was already heading into a really deep economic downturn. So, after 8 years of these historic highs and lows, how do we make sense of the Bush presidency? I mean, years later, his time in office is still one of the most consequential and debated of the modern era. This was the phrase Bush always used to define his political identity. It was his attempt to blend traditional conservative ideas, like tax cuts and a strong military, with a commitment to social issues, like education reform and global health initiatives. If you look at public opinion on his presidency today, it is still deeply divided. A lot of people praise his steady leadership and that sense of national unity he created right after 9/11. But that praise is often weighed against some heavy criticism of the Iraq War, the expansion of government surveillance, and the handling of Hurricane Katrina. But here's the bottom line. Whether you praise him or criticize him, his presidency was undeniably consequential. The decisions made during those 8 years fundamentally reshaped American foreign policy, expanded presidential power, and really set the stage for the political debates we are still having today. Which leaves us with a final thought to chew on. Was George W. Bush a leader whose deeply held convictions drove the events of his time? Or was he a president who was ultimately defined by circumstances beyond his control, forced to react to a world that changed in an instant? The answer, a lot like his legacy, is still very much up for debate.